So let's get into it. I will share my screen to dive into all of the different topics as usual. And I will start with just the kind of change log. So this is something you can have a look at in your own kind of tempo, but it also kind of highlights and summarizes the changes that we brought into the platform. The first thing is really the authentication part, and what we are now using for authentication is always OAuth 2 based. So we have had OAuth 2 based consent already for driver or consumer focused applications. For fleet, we had a different approach with service account tokens. Now this is more or less streamlined into OAuth 2. So also for server-side implementations where there's no user involved, you can still use OAuth 2 based on client credentials grants to get an access token that is then used for all of the different APIs that we support. So it kind of replaces several old authentication mechanisms that we have. I would speak about that in the end. But with OAuth 2, you can always kind of use it for all different services and endpoints that we offer. Second thing is the Beacon Data API. It's also new endpoints that are being introduced, so it's not just a matter of bumping up the version in the URL. It goes beyond that, and it's also better way to work with it, and it also supports the new authentication mechanism. I will show you that in a moment. Both of these changes are not really backwards compatible, but they are add-ons, so you can continue using the old ways of authenticating. Nothing is breaking at all, but you can also use these new authentication mechanisms if you start to integrate with high mobility, or if you want to simplify your existing workflow, you can also implement it at any point of time. Here I'm in the console, so this is a good place to start. So I want to now use a new authentication mechanism. So if I go into my develop mode, in my sandbox, I have lots of different test applications here. I can open one of our containers, and here you can already see some of these changes coming in. So on the left-hand side, we used to have OAuth client, service account keys, then client certificate. Now both service account keys, you can still access them. You can see the configurations, but they are marked as deprecated. So basically, these two tabs you no longer need to use, especially if you create new type of data containers and just start to integrate. Instead, we have the OAuth clients. So we have the OAuth client details here, and we also have OAuth client credentials grant with private key. So that mentioned that we are kind of simplifying it. We're still keeping some of that advanced mechanisms from before, so to speak, that you can create a private key in our platform, you can create a JWT to authenticate. It's basically now just streamlined into the OAuth 2 protocol or a standard that has a way of doing this as a best practice. So both of these are supported, and we have more information about how that is implemented in our docs. So we have a new documentation page which says OAuth 2 client credentials and walks you through all of the different steps that are needed to use it. Without going into too much details, you can see that in the end, you use our token API endpoint, you pass in your client ID, the client secret, and the grant type, which is client credentials, and you get an access token that can be used for 5 minutes up to 60 minutes, depending on different situations. And the separate is then with a private key JWT. I will just show you a quick snippet just to get around to it. And so this JWT token assertion is basically what we used to have on our token API endpoints. You can still work with creating private keys, creating JWTs, and then use those to authenticate. So it's a bit more implementation details to handle it. And it's a matter of use case, I would say, because here with these private keys, you can always create new ones. You can delete old ones. So it's simple to kind of rotate keys, whereas the OAuth client currently is fixed and you cannot change it from day to day. I would say enough for the theory. Let's see it in practice. So I would use Postman as mentioned to go into it. And let me go into the Postman website, because we have introduced a public collection that you can use. And here, if I go into Postman and explore, if you search for high mobility, you can already get some results. So we have high mobility public API workspace. You can open that up. And we have two different collections. One is for driver vehicle APIs, that's for consumer services, and then we have fleet vehicle APIs, which is then for fleet use cases. I will start with fleet and have a look at it. So if you click on the collection, there's also a tutorial right here. So by following these steps, you can also try it out, and that's exactly what I'm doing now. So I will hit run in Postman. It will open up this dialog. So it's possible to fork the collection, which is then recommended, because then you can always keep track and merge in further changes that we're doing to collection. In my case, I have so many forks already that I will just create a copy that I import to Postman. As soon as I choose to import the collection, I just choose my workspace. Here we go. And now I can see the same type of collection here with all the details that have been implemented. So the next step in this this tutorial is to get client credentials. So I need to open a fleet environment, enter the OAuth client ID and OAuth client secret. So I'll do that. I hit go into the environment. I can see the fleet environment. So this was downloaded together with the collection, and I can add the client ID and client secret. So let's go back to the platform, and this is my fleet app. And what I can do here is I could already have a look into one of these and then just enter the client. Let me just see what permissions I have on this one. Okay, a bunch of different permissions, so it's good for testing. And I use the OAuth client. I just copy the client ID, enter it here, and I also get the client secret. Here we go. And I hit save, and I choose to use this environment. So this is now I've configured the environment, so it's using the OAuth client. And the next step is to do actually to get access to a simulator and first get an access token. So to use any of these APIs, regardless if it's an eligibility check, vehicle data endpoint, or vehicle management, for fleet clearance, like adding new vehicles, listing vehicles, I can do that with the same type of access token that I retrieve for my account. So let's do that. I want to get my access token, because if I currently would try to get any of these list vehicles and not authorized, because I haven't done any authorization yet. So I go into this collection, I click on authorization, and here we have already pre-selected OAuth 2. And it's using already all the different configurations from the environment file, like client ID and client secret. So I can directly scroll down and hit get new access token. And already now authentication complete. So the token was retrieved based on the client ID and client secret, and I can hit use token. So now if we go back to list vehicles and hit send, I can already see some history here from past, here we go, a bit bigger, from past vehicles that I've done. So I can already authenticate to the fleet clearance endpoint to see different vehicles. And currently, I have a revoked vehicle and I have rejected vehicles. So I actually don't have any approved vehicles that I could use. So the next step would be to add a vehicle. So this is to create then a fleet clearance. So let's see the body. Here we go. I can enter the VIN of a vehicle. So let's open up the simulation and open up this simulator, for instance. And I can see the VIN. So enter the VIN. Sandbox. Hit send. And we can see the vehicle has been added. So the endpoint still using the same access token, which is still valid. I tried to get the activate this. It's currently pending. So let's see the state of if we list vehicles or get the we can use the get vehicle endpoint. So if we just paste in the VIN again, and we can see that it's now approved. So at first it was pending, and then a few seconds later it was approved, just like we used to seeing things. So now we have this vehicle approved, and we can start to fetch data. So this is now one of the big changes from the previous way we used authentication. In order to use the data API to get some vehicle data, you had to use a different type of client certificate that we had for a REST API, and you also had to manage OAuth tokens and refresh tokens. this is no longer needed. So you can use the same access token that you had for the vehicle management. You can use that to fetch data as well. And this is the kind of new endpoint that we have introduced in the platform. So if I go into the docs and hit the vehicle data API, you can see that it says that it replaces the old one. And if you go into the API reference and choose data API, we see that there's just one endpoint. And before we had tons of different endpoints. So this is the kind of old REST API. We had lots and lots of endpoints, but in the end, as you have configured your app container in our platform with exactly those permissions you want to access, there's no need to do different API endpoints, because it doesn't really improve the flow or provide any additional value. So the vehicle data API streamlines that, so you really pass in the vehicle you want data for, and you get all the data that has been granted to your application. And in the end, the JSON response looks familiar, because we're still using the auto API, the same data format. It's just the data container is a bit different, but you get all the different auto API capabilities, the properties, just as you would expect it. So there's a long list here with all the different data points. And if you search for something familiar like odometer, you can see that you get the data, you get the timestamp. And if there would be an issue, you would also get a failure instead of the data object. So you get all of those in the same response. Let's try that. So I have now access to this vehicle. So let me go in and use this endpoint. You can see this is the API base URL, vehicle data, auto API level 13, and the VIN. And the VIN I can enter here. And here we go. So we get the data here. We can see the sandbox data. Let me search for something. Odometer, perhaps. Odometer, here we go, kilometers. Oh, it's a big value, so it's shortened a bit. And we have the timestamp for 31st of October when we retrieving it. There was no failure in getting this type of data. So the endpoint really returns everything is configured for your application. And with the same tokens, I'm still reusing the same token that I created in the beginning. I could also do an eligibility check, for instance, here for this vehicle. Let me put in sandbox again. And we can see here that it's eligible, and data delivery method pull and push. So again, an existing API, but really a streamlined authentication mechanism, how you can use it. And especially if you download one of these Postman collections, you can try it out really easily. So that's for the Fleet API. And based on this configuration, you can also see that the base URL is sandboxapi.com. So of course, if you're working with live vehicle data, you can still use the same collections to try out and experiment just by removing this sandbox prefix from the URL. And that's also one of the changes with the new vehicle data API, that actually we have a change in the endpoints. So now we have all the endpoints, also the data API served on api.highmobility.com. Whereas we had before, we had REST API.highmobility.com. So that's one of the differences in the update of the vehicle data API to streamline the authentication the way we have done it. Further in documentation, we have also shown that the service account token API has been deprecated. It's also highlighted here, do not use auth tokens endpoint any longer, and instead it references to the OAuth documentation. And in the Fleet Clearance API, we have also highlighted that the access token endpoint is also deprecated. So the old flow, so to speak, was that you added a vehicle and then you would get an access token specifically for that specific vehicle, and then you could use that to get data. As mentioned, it's no longer necessary. The same one token you have for your app container, you can access the data for all of the different vehicles that have been activated for that app container. You don't have to create individual access tokens for each one of those. So again, simplifying that workflow immensely. And the last thing to show is how this works in the driver context. So if you go back here and now select the driver vehicle APIs, first thing I want to do the same thing. I want to get this to my local Postman workspace. I will import a copy. The same workspace I had before. Here we go. And opening up the driver environment. And here I need to configure it as well. So we see this, it has been preset with values for the sandbox. And for the sake of some making it maybe perhaps a bit more interesting, let's just create a new application container. So last time I had fleet application container, and now I'll do a driver application container. I will just pre-select a bunch of different permissions that have a bit more content. I'll add a name, so let's put it Open Dev Talk Data App. Here we go. And now I go into the OAuth client. I have a bit more details here. So while we only show client ID and client secret and auth token URI for fleet applications, because it's a server-to-server integration, here we have also an auth URI, because then it's an integrated consent journey that has to be done by the individual driver of the vehicle. Let's go in and paste these. Here we go. Let me just see if that is the correct client ID. Perfect. Oh, did I delete something? Oh, no, I think I just moved around. So we have the client ID and client secret. And I hit save, because even though I have the auth token URI, it's all the same for for all different sandbox applications. Going back to collections, let's see if I missed anything in the tutorial. It does say just go to OAuth client, get these values, and it also says that we should add the localhost to the redirect URI, because we want to use the integrated consent journey, so the auth flow of Postman, and then in the end it redirects back to localhost. And I will add this to the list, so it's also allowed for my application. And the next step is really to get a token. So in the same thing as for fleet APIs, we have this authorization tab. It's using OAuth 2.0, and I can just hit get a new access token. Oh. So you saw this, it failed. So basically it doesn't work, and that's just because I didn't choose the right environment. So now I use the driver environment, and I hit get new authentication, and you can see this pops up this window. So this is now the driver journey instead of the server to server. So in the fleet case, I just got an access token. In this case, it is the user journey that the driver would have to do. And we can see here that it says that the Open Dev Talk Data App will be allowed to get the following data. So it lists the different data points that have been selected for the app container. Accept and continue. Also see the terms and privacy policy, and I can choose one of the vehicles to access. So it's already pre-selected one of my simulators because I'm in the sandbox environment, and I can just hit authorize. And it says now in the end, authentication completed. So there is an access token now that this Postman has received. It shows the scope and its status approved. And I go ahead and hit use token. So the next thing I need to do is I need to use the same endpoint as we had before for getting data for this specific vehicle. But as you see, we have introduced the VIN in the URL. So that's because it used to be the case, use the one access token for one specific vehicle. Now that you can use one access token to receive data from many different vehicles, you have to define the VIN in the URL. And to do that, we have the old endpoint that already exists for our OAuth API, which is the access token info. And I can simply hit the send. For that access token, we can see that it also provides this VIN that was granted. Yeah, so I have to correct myself. So you still have to, of course, use that access token for a specific vehicle, but you have to do a one-time lookup to get the VIN after you have received the consent. So now I can go back here, enter the VIN, and do a request, and we can see the data coming in from the vehicle. It's also highlighted here, Kevin's cars. If I launch it and send a request, we can also see the incoming here in the console that the telematics command was received, and I'm able to receive the data. So the rest of the flow, working with the data, working with the simulator. Also, if I make any changes in the simulator, it gets pushed to the streaming APIs that we have, all working as usual. But with this new authentication flow, it just makes it so much easier. And you can already download the Postman collections to try it out in Sandbox. And it's already rolled out both in the Sandbox environment and also in our live environment. Hopefully you'll make a good use of this. I'm sure it will have good impacts going on, and whenever, if you're an existing user, existing developer has integrated, feel free to get in touch with us if you want to have some extra pointers. We'll also have a blog post that will come out and highlight all of those changes as well.